If you really want to understand one of the greatest catastrophes of the 19th century, Ireland's Great Famine, you've got to look backward. And I don't mean just a few years, I mean a few centuries. Because the seeds of that disaster weren't just a potato blight. They were a complex system of laws designed to completely reshape a nation. Okay, let's dive into this and see how legal ink from the 1690s cast such a long, dark shadow all the way into the 1840s.
You see, the story of the Great Famine is, at its heart, a story of a shocking and absolutely tragic contradiction. It wasn't simply a case of a country that had no food. No, the reality was way more complex and honestly much more disturbing.
I mean, just listen to this quote from the Marquette Law Review. It just captures the sheer absurdity and the central paradox of the famine perfectly. While millions of people were literally starving, huge amounts of food, grain, oats, livestock, were being shipped out of Ireland for export. People starved in a land that was technically full of food.
And that right there, that's the central mystery, isn't it? How could a country simultaneously export food and have its people starve to death? To answer that, we can't start in the 1840s. We have to go way back to the legal architecture that made this grim reality not just possible, but pretty much inevitable.
Okay, so to get to the bottom of this, we need to wind the clock back to the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The answer, as you'll see, lies in a series of statutes known collectively as the penal laws.
So what were they? Well, to put it simply, the penal laws were a systematic legal code, and they were designed with one very, very clear goal: to institutionalize the oppression of Irish Catholics. The main objective was to break their connection to the land, and by doing that, cut them off from any form of economic or political power.
And look, they weren't subtle about it. The restrictions were incredibly broad. You couldn't buy land, you couldn't get a long-term lease, you couldn't inherit land from a Protestant, you were completely barred from politics, from the army, from being a lawyer. Get this, you couldn't even own a horse worth more than £5. The strategy was crystal clear, a total, comprehensive effort to control every single path to potential advancement.
You can see here how it breaks down. These laws targeted every single aspect of life. Economically, the goal was to create a permanent, powerless tenant class. Politically, to make sure Protestants stayed dominant. Socially, to slam the door on any chance of moving up in the world. And even religiously, to suppress the Catholic faith itself. No part of society was left untouched.
Now, these laws weren't just abstract legal theories, right? For over a century, they fundamentally re-engineered Irish society. By the time we get to the 1800s, their real-world impact was just stark. They had created a society perfectly structured for disaster.
And the result? It was absolutely staggering. By the eve of the famine, pretty much every square inch of land in Ireland was owned by this tiny minority of around 10,000 Protestant landlords. This left the vast Catholic majority as tenants, often on land their own ancestors might have once owned.
This created a system of what were called tenancies at will. Now, what that meant was, with no lease and no legal protection, a tenant could be evicted for any reason at any time. So think about it. Why would you invest your time and money improving the land, building stone walls, draining the fields, when your landlord could just kick you out tomorrow and then rent that newly improved land to someone else for a higher price? You wouldn't. Of course not.
And all that land was just being subdivided into smaller and smaller plots. By 1841, an incredible 45% of all Irish tenants were trying to survive on farms of less than 5 acres. I mean, that's just not enough land to grow crops to sell and feed your family.
And this is where it all comes crashing together. To pay the rent to the landlord, tenants had to grow cash crops like grain and oats on whatever good land they had. For their own survival, on the small, poor-quality plots left over, they had to grow something that could produce the most food in the least amount of space. And that crop, it was the potato. An entire nation's survival came to depend on a single root vegetable.
But a system this oppressive, it doesn't just go unchallenged. The fight to dismantle these penal laws was a slow, grueling battle that stretched across generations and really defined the political landscape of the 18th and 19th centuries.
You can see here the process of getting rid of these laws was just so incredibly gradual. The first big changes came in the late 1700s, allowing for long leases and later the right to vote. But the huge turning point was the campaign led by Daniel O'Connell, which finally led to the landmark 1829 Emancipation Act.
But even then, as the 1870 Land Act shows, the fight for tenants' rights continued long after.
So, emancipation in 1829 was a monumental victory. It broke that political exclusion at the heart of the penal laws. Now Catholics could sit in Parliament and hold public office. But, and this is a really important but, it wasn't total equality. The highest offices were still off-limits. And more importantly, for the millions of tenant farmers out there, it did nothing to change their economic reality or their relationship with their landlords.
So by the time the potato blight arrived in 1845, yeah, the political chains had been loosened, but the economic ones were still locked firmly in place. The legacy of the penal laws had created a society that was perfectly, tragically vulnerable to collapse.
In 1841, right before the famine hit, the population of Ireland was over 8 million people. Just let that number sink in for a second. This was the society standing on the brink.
And just 10 years later, this was the count. A drop of more than 1.6 million people. The scale of the collapse it's just almost impossible to wrap your head around.
The consequences were profound, and they were permanent. Over 1 million people died from starvation and disease. Another million were forced to emigrate, starting a diaspora that would reshape cities all over the world. The Irish language, which was spoken mostly by the rural poor who were hit the hardest, went into a steep, steep decline. And the whole experience radicalized a generation, fueling a powerful new wave of Irish nationalism.
So we end up right back where we started. The Great Famine was not just a natural disaster. It was a catastrophe made possible by a man-made system. The penal laws were mostly gone from the law books by 1845, but their consequences were written all over the landscape and into the very structure of society, leaving millions with absolutely no margin for error. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? When a law is repealed, how long does its shadow truly last?